Lecture is a follow-up to our ongoing discussion of the civil rights movement. We examined last time some of the prevailing social injustices that exist, as we mentioned before, as we were taking a look at the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and the letter from a Birmingham jail and four little girls. We've been examining some of the problems with that African Americans faced during the 1960s that led to the civil rights movement. And then I wanted to think about this in terms of how do we see ongoing struggles in terms of race relations today. And we examined Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of White Privilege, and getting us to think about how we can often be blinded today by the privileges that we enjoy, and so that can tend to get us not to think about the ongoing racial injustices that exist, and we tend to think about the civil rights movement as something that is only something that happened in the 1960s and before, rather than thinking about some of the lasting legacy of racial inequality. And so I wanted you to think about that. And we ended our discussion by examining some of the racial problems that we see today in terms of how we see illegal immigrants or refugees. And we tend to examine them with a very narrow lens of seeing them as coming into this country as an infestation, causing chaos or taking jobs or providing some type of social instability. And we've seen all of these, the same rhetoric of these ideas as we've examined Nazi Germany, as the Nazis had a very narrow view of Jewish people who were taking people's jobs. They were viewed as an infestation, and they were then uh, viewed as something to be afraid of. In continuing that discussion, I wanted to examine the similar kind of rhetoric that we can see today with racial injustice and how we tend to view others. And generally, at the root of all of this fear, out of all this inequality, is fear of otherness. And today, I wanted to take a look at how art grapples with this fear and racial injustice. And I wanted to start today with a quote by Leonard Bernstein, who was the composer to West Side Story, and he was thinking about the racial injustices of the 1960s. He said the following. He says, "This is our reply to violence, to make music more intensely, more beautifully, more devotedly than ever before." Close quote. And his quote here gets us to really think about what is the very purpose of art. That it is to get us to overcome the violence and the conflict that seem to permeate our culture. And so I want you to think about art as a way of healing, as a way of overcoming. And as we think about we've arts in the past, some of our past discussions I have on the slide here, Picasso's Guernica, and I want you to think about how Guernica was a way of healing, Picasso's way of grappling with the atrocities that happened in Guernica, a small village in Spain, where thousands of people were killed at the um, at the hand of Adolf Hitler and his air force, and how uh, Picasso takes that brutal moment, a savage moment of Spanish history during the Spanish Civil War, and he takes the narrative and he empowers the people of Guernica, the Basques, by giving them a voice, by calling attention to the problems of injustice and discrimination and violence. And by doing so, he finds a way to take that narrative and move through it and find a way to heal. And so I want you to think about it. I mean, sometimes modern art can look very ugly or very gruesome, but in some ways it's taking a look at the ugliness and the gruesome qualities of our contemporary culture and finding a way to find beauty within the ugliness. And so as we move forward, I want you to think about the following question: how can art help to overcome pain and suffering caused by violence? And what would this look like? As we take a look at our society today, sometimes our art, our media, our film tends to be a little bit frivolous and superficial, as we see with the Avengers, for instance, which I have another image on the slide. Yes, us to think about, is the Avengers or films like this actually helping us to overcome pain and suffering, or is it mainly just a distraction from it? Right. So that's another thing to think about in terms of what is the purpose of art, or what should be the purpose of art? How is it different from something such as entertainment? As we take a look at this idea, I want to pause for a moment and think about Toni Morrison, and who is one of the greatest writers, greatest American writers of the 20th century, and her comment on race. And the interviewer is going to ask her if she ever is going to write a book that is not about race. And I think she has an interesting response to this that I wanted you to think about, and then we'll come back and after the clip, and we'll talk about some of the points that she indicates here.
Phil Moyers, I think, once asked you the question, can you imagine writing a novel that's not centered about race? And you said, absolutely.
Yes.
Will you?
That's what he asked me. I think, you see, I answered the question he didn't pose. You know, Tolstoy writes about race.
Yeah.
All the time. So does Zola. So does James Joyce. Now, if anybody can go up to an imaginary James Joyce and say, you write about race all the time. It's central in your novels. When are you going to write about what? Because you see, the person who asks that question doesn't understand that he or she is also raced. So to ask me when am I going to stop, or when, if I can, is to ask a question that, in a sense, is its own answer. Yes, I can write about white people. White people can write about black people. Anything can happen in art. There are no boundaries there. Having to do it or having to prove that I can do it is what was embarrassing or insulting. In this book, I did.
I like how Morrison points out the hypocrisies that literature about African Americans invariably are said to be about race, whereas books about whites are said to be about the human condition. And she points out the double standard that would be if you take a book, for instance, such as The Great Gatsby, which has uh, almost entirely white characters. Generally, we don't think of that as a book about race. We think about it as a book about the American dream, about the modern American experience, but we generally don't think about it in terms of race. But if you take another book that has predominantly African American characters, such as A Raisin in the Sun, we then say that is a book about race. And so she indicates, why do we think that a book about all whites is not about race, where a book about all African Americans is about race? And what she suggests is that a book that has only whites in it is about race. And the white privilege of that is to assume that it's not, to take for granted that the issues that are being represented within the story are not about race, when invariably they are. And so I think that's an interesting way to frame our discussion of art uh, and our discussion of literature, as we'll take a look at with Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. The first work that I wanted to discuss in terms of race is getting back to our ongoing discussion of Norman Rockwell and how he contextualizes um, art and propaganda. And I want you to think about this one in terms of whether this particular work or a work like this is leading towards healing, growth, recovery in terms of race relations. This one is entitled "New Kids in the Neighborhood," and I imagine that this painting could take place in any small town in Idaho or Utah, where it's predominantly a white community, and another family moves in who is of a different ethnicity, and some of the awkwardness and the complexities that may arise with two groups of people seeing a different race for the first time and not being quite sure of what to do and how to interact, and mainly seeing only differences at first. But as we come to know one another, we start to see similarities. And I think that's the main argument that we need to think about in terms of art and healing is the more that we understand the complexities and the humanity of other people, the more we can start to appreciate the similarities rather than only seeing the differences. And that was one of the main reasons why I wanted you to watch the documentary Four Little Girls, is it really helps to humanize the victims of that atrocity. Within this one, what we see is a kind of a hope of the future, that although there's this initial awkwardness where you can see that there is a physical separation between these two families and they're unsure of how to move forward, we can assume that at some point they'll start to just be children, right? That these larger socio political, racial issues that are underneath the surface are really something that's more for adults, and they should transcend children. Children should just be kids, and they should just be playing. They should just be enjoying their childhood and not worrying about these larger social issues that adults seem to impose upon the human condition. And so what we see here is a hope that maybe if these children were able to work out their differences, the future could be brighter. Of course, the subtext of this is that we do not see the adults, the parents, interacting at all, and so there is some larger social tensions that are beneath the surface, and so it could be that that as they start learning to play with one another, the adults will try to teach them that they should be different, that they should be separate, and so maybe you could argue that there are still some lingering residual elements of tension between them, but there is a sense of, like all Rockwell paintings, a sense of hope, kind of this undercurrents of happiness and coming together that we see. We see another component to this within the problem that we all live with, right? And he doesn't even have to spell out what that problem is. All he has to do is title it "The Problem That We All Live With," and show a little African American girl who is Ruby Bridges at the age of 6, who's going to her William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans in the 1960s. And what we see with this is the problem that we all live with is going to be the racial tension, and that is something that's the undercurrent of society, and something that we can try to ignore. We can try to pretend it isn't there, but there's still these tensions that are brewing under the surface. And so the racism that we see here is mainly part of the subtext, right? We see her surrounded by U.S. Marshals. We don't even see their heads, right? Because it's not really about them. It's about the fact that they have to be there to protect her as she walks to school. Something, again, how racism, these larger social issues affect children, right? That children aren't born racist. They're not born focusing on differences. They're mainly focused on trying to find ways that they can then play and they can, enjoy their life. And that's these larger issues that they are taught, these patterns of behavior that are learned over the years that start to influence the way that they see the world. And so we can assume that little Ruby here as she goes to school, and we see the tomato on the right hand side that's been thrown at her, and then the writing on the wall on the back, right, the graffiti, is an indication of some of the ugliness that's in the world that she has to live in, right? So the problem that we all live with is the ugliness of humanity and the ugliness of racism and the brutality and violence that is the undercurrent of the human condition. But again, there is hope as she walks towards school. She's going to receive a better education now that she's going to go to this desegregated elementary school, that she'll be able to have more of an equal opportunity. So again, there's a kind of a muted hope in the future that eventually her life and conditions in general will be better. So again, the hope here is that there's a healing within this, right? Exposing the problems of racial tensions of a little girl going to school is giving a voice, is casting a spotlight, much like what we see with Picasso's Guernica, casting a spotlight on the problem so that we can move forward. We see with Jacob Lawrence, he has a slightly different aesthetic, but it's a similar idea that we see with Rockwell's The Problem That We All Live With. Here we see the coming together of soldiers and students, and this weird kind of, coming together that has to happen because of racism, right? Soldiers and students really shouldn't be coming together hand in hand, right? They live in different worlds. One is protecting from enemies. One is protecting from, exterior violence, generally associated with war. But here they have to be accompanying school children on their way to just receive an education, right? Which should be a basic human right that everyone should be able to have an education. And the more people that have an education would mean society is becoming better, right? The more people that are educated, the more people that are trained, the more people that are more aware, right, is only going to lead to more progress and growth. But here, the undercurrent is that education should be denied to some people, right? So again, similar to the problem that we all live with, we see that the inherent racial tensions that are the larger than this the simplicity of going to school and receiving education is affecting the smallest, the most vulnerable people within a particular society. So again, what we see here is Lawrence is exposing that problem, those tensions that are being teased out, and the soldiers that have to carry guns in one hand, and the children that have to carry books in their other hand. And so kind of an interesting connection between violence and education, which shouldn't really go hand in hand. We've seen this one earlier in the semester. This is an African American artist, Faith Ringgold, and as the United States was preparing to go to the moon, as a way to plant a flag on another world, so to speak, the moon, to demonstrate our superiority over the Soviet Union. Ringgold takes a look at, yes, that's great that we have this human progress and scientific development, and the United States has a lot of wonderful components to it, but there's also this inherent negative. And if we only focus on the positive components to it, then essentially we become propagandistic. And if we really want to improve, we have to really confront the ugliness of the world around us. If we really want to improve, we have to look at ourselves in the mirror honestly and think about ways that we can improve. And so here, as she says, this is the flag that we should plant on the moon. We have the words "die" and an African American slang, a derogatory slang, written as the stripes, to juxtapose the freedom and the ideals that America stands for and the harsh realities of what it's not promoting. This one demonstrates the inherent racism that's going on within the South, again, to expose the problems of the civil rights movement and the growing Ku Klux Klan, which is using terrorism in order to keep people in a constant state of fear, to keep people under control. And notice that the passage of the Civil Rights Act was in 1964, and then there's another one in 1965, and this one is painted in 1969. And so, even though there's more equality and more access to forms of justice within after 1964 and 1965, the problems of racism just didn't end there, right? They continue on. And here we see these three Ku Klux Klan members that are driving around the city, promising to bring security and stability, but what they're really bringing is insecurity and instability through their use of terrorism. This one is again exposing the problems within the South, and this one says, just as in the anatomy of man, every nation has to have its hind parts or must have its hind parts, and here we have that centered on Alabama. Some of the roots of segregation and racism were centered in Alabama, and this art is exposing that. But again, what I want you to think about is that how what we have here with Robert Indiana is he's exposing the differences, or the kind of teasing out the differences between propaganda and art, right? So where does one begin? Where does one end, right? He's calling attention to a problem. He's very specifically saying, right, what are the problems here? Does this have that multivalence? Does this have more of a room for interpretation? Or is it more explicit and more direct, more agitative in the way it's confronting it? So in some ways, I think we can associate this with propaganda. But what I want you to think about is this moving towards healing, is casting a spotlight on this rather than sweeping it under the proverbial rug, is leading us towards progress. What we see with David Hammons and the door to the admissions office is another interesting juxtaposition. Here is the admissions office that has an access towards school. This is where people's academic journey begins, as being admitted into whatever university you're applying to. But what's stopping them, right? So the door is not only something that opens opportunities, it's also something that can be closed and eliminate people's opportunities. And here the door is closed, and we have a person's on the other side hand prints and face prints. It's profile. That's printed on the glass door, and the profile here is someone's being frisked. Right, so their hands are above their head. So this is exposing some of the racial injustices that even though this was done in 1969, that still continue to be a problem today, as African Americans still have a better chance of going to prison and losing their constitutional rights today than they do have graduating from college. And so the judicial system still is inherently racist and has, even though Lady Liberty is supposed to be blind, in reality, the effect of racial injustice is that that liberty tends to, like Lady Liberty or Lady Justice, tends to have a very racial lens and does not see race equally. And then this last image that I wanted to share with you, this was an image that was submitted in Flint, Michigan, and actually won the state prize. Every year, Michigan does an art prize for the best art of the year. This one won in 2017 and is in reference to Flint, Michigan. And what happened in Flint, Michigan, which is predominantly an African American community, was that there was a problem with their water supply, where the government officials decided to find a cheaper water source, and the water source that they found was actually contaminated, and it started to yellow and brown and rust-colored water started coming from the water from the faucets and the bathtubs. And at first, the government officials tried to cover this up. They tried to say, no, it's not as bad as it seems. But the more people investigated, the more they found that this is widespread political corruption, and so people had to. It was a huge emergency in the state, and people had to boil water and have access to bottled water, and still to this day, there are still problems with contamination in Flint, Michigan. And so what Moore is exposing here is the racial injustices that still exist. And so he uses a very famous image of the segregated water fountain in the South, which we examined earlier this semester, and where there was a white water fountain, and then there's a colored water fountain for African Americans. And here he's exposing that injustice in the 1960s, that was the sole purpose of the civil rights movement, was to end segregation and unjust laws, continues on to this day. That is not just a problem of the past, that segregation and injustices still exist, even within our policies, such as access to water, clean water, access to utilities, that things aren't exactly fair today or equal today. And so he's exposing some of those problems and casting a spotlight on this idea that the propaganda tells us that we're in a better state than we were in the past. And in many ways, there's truth to that propaganda, but it's also overly simplistic and quite dismissive to suggest that there are no problems lingering today. And so he's casting a spotlight on the lingering problems. As we take a look, the next part we're going to take a look at is Hansberry's Raising the Sun, and we're going to take a look at further racial injustices and the access to the American dream, and that will conclude our unit on the civil rights movement and propaganda.